Hi, today we're going to be talking about the evolution of the human brain. And in this talk, we're going to be covering the human evolution as a species. We're going to be looking at the evolution of brains and behaviour in general. And we're going to be looking at the development of human brain size. And the reason it's focusing on brain size is because the fossil record doesn't show what the contents of the brain look like, the actual organic part of the brain. All it can show is where the brain sat in the skull. So the fossil record shows us the size of the brain and the different lumps and bumps on the brain, but not actually what the inside of the brain looked like. So evolutionary biologists have made some educated assumptions as to what all these lumps and bumps and brain size really mean. And we'll be talking about that. Okay, now to the first section, which is human evolution. In this section, we have three subsections. We'll be comparing humans and great apes in the evolutionary process. We'll look at the evolutionary tree of homonyms. And homonyms, of course, are the human family. And finally, we'll take a look at Homo Sapiens, which is the sole survivor of all the different branches of the human family. And we are it. Whether for better or for worse, we are it. Now, comparing humans and great apes, our closest living relatives are chimpanzees. And the next closest are gorillas and orangutans. And the last common ancestor for all four of those, that's us, chimpanzees, gorillas and orangutans, lived 10 million years ago. So we've had 10 million years to go our own ways. Now, the last known common ancestor with chimpanzees was about between 5 and 7 million years ago. So you can average that out to about 6 million years. And at that time, something happened to cause a speciation event, some sort of probably environmental event, which sent us, the human homonyms, off in one direction and the chimpanzees off in another. And we saw in one of our previous talks that the way that speciation events happen is when a species gets divided and in populations, and there's no mixing. So over time, mutations cause changes in each branch of the particular species to the point where they're no longer recognizable as the same species. They are completely two different species. So one of these branches led to chimpanzees, and the other one led to homonyms, and eventually to us, Homo sapiens. Now the branch or the family tree of homonyms has quite a few branches on it, and up until the present time, I reckon there are probably around about 12, 13 different types of homonyms. That's humans, not Homo sapiens, but not just Homo sapiens, but different types of homonyms. And we'll talk about those as we go along. However, we are not able, or have not been, scientists have not yet been able to trace a direct descent from the common ancestor with chimpanzees. So it's like we have the missing link in there somewhere. However, what we do know is that we share about 95% of our DNA with chimpanzees. So there's no doubt that we had a common ancestor. And as I said, I should have said 15, not 13. There are about 15 species of homonym. And the different species, of course, were caused by the forces of evolution, mutation, natural and sexual selection, gene flow, and genetic drift. And that led to repeated episodes of speciation as populations of the same species got isolated from each other. And out of all of this, there's only one species that managed to survive to the present time, and that is Homo sapiens. And the first known homonym is a guy called, or girl called, Ardipithecus ramidus. And it was discovered in Ethiopia in 1990. And this species of homonym lived about 4.4 million years ago. And it would look more like a chimp than human, with a relative small brain size. However, it walked upright at least some of the time. Unlike a chimp, it spent more time upright than chimps do. And then 3.5 million years ago, a guy called, or a girl called Astrolopithecus Afarensis was also discovered in Ethiopia. That was in 1974. And it had the skull the same size as a chimpanzee, could walk upright most of the time, the same as we do. And they think that walking upright evolved before the evolution of a large brain. So what that means is the act of walking upright stimulates, or could have stimulated the development of a larger brain than chimpanzees have. Homo erectus lived 2 million years ago and looked like a modern human. It had a larger brain than the Astrolopithecus. It made stone tools, both of which suggest a much greater level of it made stone tools, and it suggests a larger level of intelligence. And it was the first known homonym species to leave Africa, and it's been found as far east as Southeast Asia. And the remains of Homo erectus were discovered in Java in 1891, and it's obvious that they left Africa between 100 and 60,000 years ago. However, hominin evolution involved radiations in all directions, geographic and anatomical, not just a single line. So it wasn't a straight linear progression. It went off in all different sorts of directions. And on the island of Flores in Indonesia, a species called Homo floresiensis, it's a hard one to say, Homo floresiensis, which dated back to 100,000 to 60,000 years ago. And they were sort of pygmies. They stood only 3 feet 6 inches tall. And it suggests that Homo erectus crossed the open ocean from Java to this island of Flores. That particular part of the ocean is very deep and would never have dried out in any of the ice ages. So there always was a body of water between Java and the island of Flores. So they were able to cross that water, and they became stranded and evolved a thing called island dwarfism. And from our previous topics, we can realize that this is called biogeography. So it's island biogeography, where a species gets stuck on an island and through mutations goes off in different directions, or a different direction from the original species. In this case, it would have been Homo erectus. And then it evolved into Homo floresiensis. Probably one of the reasons why the Homo floresiensis was small was lack of resources. To grow large, you need a lot of food. And if you don't get a lot of food, then your physical size starts to shrink. Now, Homo sapiens evolved in East Africa about 300,000 years ago, and they lived alongside other hominin species between then and about 60,000 years ago, or actually 20,000 years ago, really. And it was during this time that there was a rapid increase in brain size. Originally, the hominin brain size increased slowly till about 800,000 years ago, and then it suddenly began to increase rapidly. And this coincided with the period of extreme climate fluctuation in the human environment, or in the world environment, the geography of the world. So it was obvious that individuals with larger brains and greater intelligence had a greater survival advantage. So if you put together walking upright, creating larger brains, and then the need for those who survived most likely had the larger brains and the greater intelligence, and they were the ones that got to pass their genes on, and those who didn't survive didn't. And hence the size of the brains gradually or rapidly increased after that time. And one of the homonyms that existed during that time, that's between 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, was a species called Homo Naledi, and it was found in South Africa. And it had hands and feet like Homo Sapiens, but skulls and teeth like Homo Erectus. So it was a bit of a hybrid of both. And of course, as we said before, there were 15 different homonyms evolving beside Homo Sapiens. Now, probably some of the most known homonyms that existed side by side with us were the Denisovans and the Neanderthals. And the Denisovan DNA has been found from as far north as Siberia and as far south as Australia. That's in the Aboriginal population. 5%, there's 5% DNA in Aboriginal Australian Aboriginal Denisovan DNA in Australian Aboriginal Aborigines, and there's about 7 to 10% Denisovan DNA in Papua New Guineans. And they survived alongside Homo sapiens up till about 70,000 years ago. And as we said, as a general rule of thumb, modern humans have 5% Denisovan and Neanderthal DNA as part of their makeup. And one report has it that the trait of red hair is a Neanderthal trait. So if you have any relatives or friends with red hair, you know where they came from. Okay, I'm free of that problem, not having much hair at all. Okay, the evolution of brains and behaviour. In other words, we're going to take a look at the connection between brains and behaviour and how that comes about. So first, we're going to look at the study of behaviour itself, how that's done, genetic changes and the consequences, the brain comparisons, and the connection between brain size and communication ability. First, we're going to look at relative brain size. Absolute brain size is not a great indicator of intelligence. In other words, a whale has probably the largest brain in existence. However, it cannot lay claim to being the most intelligent, although we cannot know that because we can't talk to them and they can't talk to us. However, scientists take relative brain size, the size of the brain compared to the size of the body, as a better indicator of intelligence in a species. Now, the way that they examined the early behaviour was through trace fossils. So it wasn't the fossils of the animals or the organisms themselves, because we're going back billions of years now. It's the tracks that they left behind in the sedimentary rock. Now, for a long, long time, the tracks went in straight lines, which meant that there wasn't a lot happening up top as far as brain capacity went, and making decisions and controlling their direction. As evolution continued on through the more billions of years, these organisms started to go in curves and circles and complicated patterns, which indicated that the brains of organisms were beginning to develop the ability to control at least the path that the organism was taking. So we just already said all of that. That's about trace fossils and how the complexity of their movements indicates the brain complexity as well. Now, when a biologist is studying behaviour, they look at four questions. The first question is, what is the physiological mechanism that's functioning at the moment? What is it that they're studying in the body? Is the behaviour instinctual or is it learned? How does the behaviour affect the ability to survive or reproduce? And how has the behaviour evolved? So if we're looking at evolutionary biology, they're the four fundamental questions. That's what mechanism are they looking at? Is it learned or behaviour or instinctual? Is the behaviour learned or instinctual? Does the behaviour affect the ability to survive or reproduce? And how has that behaviour evolved? Of course, there are many behaviours in organisms that do not affect the ability to survive or reproduce. So they would have negligible influence on the evolution of the behaviour of the organism. It's the ones that have a significant effect on survival and reproduction that count. Now, genetic changes. So we've been able now in recent times, like the last 20 years, to really hone in on the study of genes and genomes. And this has greatly accelerated the knowledge that we have about the evolution of organisms and the connection or the evolutionary connection between organisms. Now, one thing that they do is compare the brains of other species with our brains to provide insights into how other organisms perceive the world. So in other words, it's which part of a species' brain is dominant that will determine how they see the world. And for example, a dog has a highly developed ability to smell. So the world of a dog consists of a map of smells. Human beings have both visual and auditory, so we can smell, of course, but we don't have a sort of a super sense. Like some organisms can sense the magnetic flux lines of planet Earth, so they can fly or swim from one part of the planet to the other. Some reptiles can sense movement by sticking their tongue on the ground, and that's how they sense. That's how they picture the world. So, whatever aspect or whatever section of our brain is dominant will determine how we see the world and how we understand the world. Now, inside a brain is a thing called the primary somatosensory cortex, and that's the part of the brain where the senses end up. And if a organism was predominantly visual, the visual part of that cortex would be largest. If, like a dog, it's primarily to do with olfactory, with the smells, then the olfactory part of the somatosensory cortex would be biggest. And in human beings, you can see different sizes in this somatosensory cortex according to how which senses the particular individual favors. In other words, if you favor your visual sensory abilities rather than auditory, then your visual part of the cortex will be larger than the auditory part. Okay. Now, one important aspect of more advanced brains is the ability to communicate. I've noticed with my chooks that if any bird species puts out an alarm or a warning call, they know that they should be on guard. So I don't know what it is about birds in general, but they all seem to be able to tune into each other's warning calls. And not only that there is a danger, but where the danger is. Is it a airborne, like a chicken hawk danger, or is it ground-borne? Is it a someone coming with an axe to make Christmas dinner out of them? But as well as that, within the particular species, I noticed that my chooks have a particular call when one of them is lost, or in other words, they become separated from the bunch or from their particular buddy. Every chook has their own particular buddy. And when they get separated from their buddy, they have a particular call that they make. And the buddy responds with an appropriate call in response. But the call is always the same. It never changes, and they never use that call for any other purpose. So they have part of their brain which is devoted to communication abilities. Now, the human species has the communication, as far as we know, has the communication market sewn up. We are the only species that we know that can communicate in writing. In other words, we can put our thoughts, create symbols to convey our thoughts from one person to another, as well as using our voice. Yeah. And of course, in human beings, the language centers are very predominant. They take up quite a large section of the brain, and they say that the fact that we developed language accounts for the fact why our brain is 3 times larger than a chimpanzee. And although there's no definite proof from that, proof of that, it's what do you call it? It's an assumption from the known data. So human beings have a much larger neocortex, which is, of course, the outer section of the brain on top there, on top of all the other sections that come up through evolution. The last bit, the neocortex on top, we have a very large neocortex compared to other species. And this has a lot to do with our ability to communicate. And from a gender point of view, females of the human species have a larger language portion of the brain than male members of the species. Also, the female olfactory nerve or bulb is 10 times larger than a male's. So you can make of that what you want, but that's just a difference in the brain. So the cerebral cortex is responsible or mediates the more advanced abilities that we have, particularly the ability to communicate with other members of our species and to cooperate with them. So once we developed language, that enabled us to cooperate. And I guess it's a bit like a circle where the greater our language ability, the more brain power we need. So we build a bigger brain. The bigger brain we get, the more language we can have, and so on. So one builds the other. And they used to think that tool making was the thing that set Homo sapiens apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. In fact, that isn't true. There are many birds and other animals that use tools, even octopuses can use tools. So tool making isn't the thing. The thing is language and the ability to write that language down in symbols and pass it on to the next generation. So our ability to work together, to cooperate by using language, enabled us to survive much better than other species. And this could account for why Denisovans and Neanderthals didn't make it the full distance. It's possible that they didn't have the same communication abilities that we have, and therefore their ability to cooperate, while good, was pretty good, wasn't as good as ours. Okay. Now the language section of the brain, the human brain, isn't just a single part. There are 4 different parts. There's a part in the left temporal lobe and a part in the right temporal lobe. That's the temporal lobes on the side. And there's another part in the front, left and right frontal lobe. So we don't have just a single part, single section. Now, it is assumed that large brains are linked to greater intelligence. However, don't mistake intelligence with wisdom. Although we have a large brain and a higher level of intelligence, we think that most species, we are not necessarily wiser than most species. So wisdom must come in a different part of the brain, a different part of the species. Yeah. The name that we have, Homo sapiens, loosely means wise man. In fact, I would like to change that to either Homo cleverensis, means clever man, or Homo imbecilis, Homo stupid man. When you look at what we've done to the planet and in the process of doing to the planet, there's not a lot of wisdom there. Okay. Now we're going to look at this section on brain size. As I said, they can't tell much about brains in evolutionary times because the brain matter itself didn't fossilize. However, the hole in the skull where the brain sat, the cranial cavity, does show something about the brain. Now, from the beginning of the hominid species to us, our brains tripled in size. So our brains are 3 times larger than Homo ramidus. Going back to the first guy, Astrolopithecus ramidus. And Australopithecine brains, we'll take a look at those, which is sort of the next step down. And then Homo habilis and Homo erectus brains, and then finally Homo sapien brains. And what happened to us after we invented agriculture? We stopped being hunter-gatherers and settled down and started having plenty of food, but food of a limited variety. Okay, so across nearly 7 years of our 7 million years of our evolution, our brain has tripled in size, but most of this growth has occurred in the last 2 million years. And the precise factors that led to the development of large brains, large complex brains, have not yet been discovered. In other words, we got some pretty good guesses as to why, but there's no definitive answer as to what led to the human species having a brain that far outweighed all other species' brains as far as complex abilities are concerned. Now, the Australopithecine brain, which the Australopithecines lived 3.5 million years ago, started to show subtle changes in structure and shape. Like I said, that's all we can know, the size and the shape, and the lumps and bumps inside the skull. So that started to change from the hominins that lived prior to 3.5 million years ago. So that was sort of the beginning of the accelerated, or getting towards the accelerated growth of the human brain. And Homo habilis, 1.9 million years ago, had a modest increase in brain size over what happened before, including an expansion of a language-connected part of the frontal lobe. And Homo erectus, 1.8 million years ago, had brains averaging a bit larger than a modern gorilla. So when we get down to 500,000 years ago, or put this way, by 500,000 years ago, the hominin brains had doubled in size. And then 300,000 years ago, Homo Sapiens appeared. And that's when the acceleration really took up. I mean, the brain size acceleration really started. And we developed complex cultural and linguistic abilities. And the changes in the shape of the brain indicate that we had better planning abilities, better communication abilities, problem-solving abilities, and some other more advanced cognitive functions. So it's obvious that something happened 300,000 years ago, or after 300,000 years ago, to really accelerate the development of the brain, the human brain. Now, after the invention of agriculture, when human beings said, oh, it's much easier just to sit in one place, plant foods, plant the seeds, grow our food. We don't have to go wandering all over the place. We don't have to go and kill wild animals. We can domesticate animals, and instead of us going to the animals come to us. Of course, it didn't happen all of a sudden. It happened over a period of thousands of years, over millennia. This process of change from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, fully blown agriculture. However, with the advent of fully blown agriculture, human species started to live on a much more limited variety of food items. And of course, the possibility of famine was more likely too, because the more you rely on a single species or a few species, and something happens to limit the harvest of that species, then you're in big trouble. Whereas a hunter-gatherer, if one species of plant wasn't doing too well, they could move to some other species, and eat those instead. So this limited nutrition in the post-agricultural world started a shrinkage of brains. So our brains started to shrink again until about 100 years ago, when universal childhood nutrition improved. So more and more of the human species started to get more nutrition in their childhood years, and the number of diseases that people were dying of declined. The size of the human brain has started to rebound. So our heads are getting bigger. And if the hat doesn't fit anymore, that's why. All right. Well, it's been an interesting trip through the evolution of the human brain today. And we'll see what next time brings. Okay. Bye for now.